And we just heard T.N. Providence and the Jazz Zone. He played some nice music from one of my favorite musicians of all time, Mr. Milt Jackson, the vibe player. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, who is an African historian who holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And his books covers the waterfront. They go all the way from Hank Aaron, who was from Mobile, Alabama, to Shaka and the Zulus, and back from Bessie Smith to Burning Spear. And Dr. Horne, how are you doing today?
Oh, it's all good. How about yourself?
I can only speak for myself. I'm almost perfect. I just have some mobility issues. I got some. It's working. I'm walking a little bit better today, but other than that, I'm fine.
Right on.
I'm doing okay. It rained on, so I'm happy about that.
And I guess the first question we wanted to ask is, how did you see former President Barack Hussein Obama in his statement about Black men?
Well, for those who may not have heard, President Obama, in remarks made on behalf of the campaign of Kamala Harris, rebuked and reprimanded Black men, some of whom he said were reluctant to cast their ballots for Vice President Harris, apparently on grounds of gender. And what's remarkable about this statement is that Mr. Obama, he has styled himself as being the non-racial man par excellence. He made it clear that he was the president of the United States, not the president of Black America. Fair enough. But yet, when he speaks to Black people in general, he rarely speaks in anything but a chiding and condescending and patronizing phrasing, which is unfortunate because if you're going to make a critique of voting in the United States, we know that the highest percentage vote for Kamala Harris will come from Black women, 9-1. Number two, inevitably, will be Black men, which will be 8-2 or 7-3 in a worst case scenario. Now, one wonders, since Mr. Obama styles himself as being a leader of the whole country, why didn't he have a word to say about how Euro-American women are voting? They didn't vote in the majority for Hillary. They voted for a misogynist like Mr. Trump. The same thing will probably happen in 2024. Why not a peep? Why not a mumbling word about Euro-American men, even union members? We know that in the Deep South, where I'm now sitting, that there's a remarkable cross-class coalition of Euro-Americans, that is to say, class collaboration, Euro-Americans from the poor to the wealthy, voting 9-1 for the right wing. Not a mumbling word. And what's interesting is that a lot of people on the left don't even know this. And so it was really disappointing that Mr. Obama passed up an opportunity to engage in some political education and instead turned his lens on a constituency, Black men, who have been in the crosshairs for centuries. It's no accident that we were disproportionately lynched. It's no accident that we have disproportionately been sitting on death row, waiting to be executed by the state. It's no accident that with regard to police terror, being executed without due process of law by officers of the state, we've been disproportionately impacted. And Mr. Obama is obviously intelligent. And so if he was going to make an analysis of Black male voting patterns, perhaps he would like to factor in what I've just articulated if he wanted to make a critique. But that was all absent. That was all missing. He really did a disservice. And I say this as well, because I won't mention any names unless you press me. But there is a tendency on the Euro-American left, as I mentioned before, to suggest that so-called identity politics is the problem, and that helps to prevent class-based organizations. In fact, I'll just come out with it. Norman Finkelstein, who has done yeoman labor on the anti-Zionist front, he has a new book out, and that's basically what he's saying. And of course, he really needs to go back to the fundamentals of social science, because the enslaved population was the unpaid sector of the working class. And his presumption is that the unpaid sector of the working class has interests 100% of the time with the paid sector of the working class, which my work has shown is not necessarily the case. Just like the unpaid sector of the working class was more willing and likely to align with real and imagined antagonists of U.S. republicanism and U.S. imperialism, including Native American nations, including invading redcoats in the War of 1812, all the way down to the Socialist Project in the 20th century. And why he doesn't recognize that, it's quite baffling. And then I happened to catch a podcast of Chris Hedges, the former New York Times reporter, and he and his guest, Christian Parenti, the son of Michael Parenti, who I, of course, have enormous respect for. Christian Parenti has a new book out where he's bashing what he calls wokeness. Now, I don't know if they're trying to audition for Fox News, but that's a Fox News talking point. Wokeness basically means anti-racism, anti-sexism, and obviously they have a problem with that. Now, what they try to do is camouflage that backwardness by focusing on individuals like Ibram X. Kendi of Boston University, a Black man who has sold best-selling books. But even there, they stub their toe, because if we are, as many of us suspect, on the verge of fascism, then certainly Ibram X. Kendi will be part of the anti-fascist coalition. So why they're going after him is baffling, befuddling, and certainly problematic. And it's of a piece, once again, with this insulting analysis by President Obama, who, of course, all of these Euro-American men have problems with Obama, but interestingly enough, they find themselves to a certain degree on the same page.
You're listening to Diasporic Music with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. And I wanted to ask you, I remember reading Barack Hussein Obama's memoir, and he talked about going into a meeting, and I'm certain that he was talking about going into a Socialist Workers' Party's meeting, and the Socialist Workers' Party split from the American Communist Party. I don't know, the 40s or 50s, and he was talking about the different, 20s probably, followed the split between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, and Barack Hussein Obama was explaining the argument, and I have heard that argument in meetings. I mean, wouldn't you say that Barack Hussein Obama is pretty sharp in terms of he knows what time it is, but he's basically just playing the imperialist game to be in the mix?
Well, you say he knows that argument. What argument are you referring to?
Oh, the argument, the fact that there's differences between, tactical arguments between the Stalinists and the Trotskyists, on many questions. The question of the Negro nation and the rights to self-determination. The Trotskyites claim, that African people in America had a right to self-determination, whereas the CP had that position for many years, and they dropped it. And I think, from what I understand now, they're more sympathetic towards the black belt, not necessarily black belt thesis, but the thesis of Africans in America having the right to self-determination, if I'm correct in saying that.
Well, yeah, you're raising a lot of issues, and it might take us down a rabbit hole to go into all of them. But let me say, for the sake of the audience, that I deal with some of those issues in my recently published book, Armed Struggle, which you can find at better bookstores everywhere. But I thought that with regard to the argument, I thought you were going to focus on this rather banal point already referenced, whereby Black people are accused of being disruptive of class solidarity, supposedly because of our identity politics. And what's remarkable about Finkelstein in particular, I mean, he's written book after book about the identity politics of Jewish Americans. That's all Zionism is. And obviously that kind of identity politics dovetails with the overriding interests of US imperialism, which we'll talk about in a minute. And with regard to this so-called wokeness, Mr. Parenti, and apparently Mr. Hedges too, they feel that when Black people are able to wring concessions, for example, from the Fortune 500 corporations that force them to go against their Jim Crow policies and hire us or engage in anti-racist seminars, that supposedly that's a gift from the Fortune 500 that they're doling out to us to disrupt working class unity, as opposed to something we have to wring from them over their objection. And of course, he needs to ask himself why we oftentimes have to fight by ourselves on the anti-racist front. Where are these so-called militant Euro-American workers, where, as I said, in the South, vote 9-1 for the right wing? Apparently, they're either unaware of that basic reality of US politics, or they're trying to throw dust in the eyes of the US public. Perhaps there's a combination of the two.
Well, as Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly Hubert Geraldo Brown, H-Rap Brown, would say, he has a bit of advice for the left. That advice, don't get left.
Well, it's a very serious question because, as I said, we're staring down the barrel of fascism right now. We need clear thinking. Certainly, we don't need to be attacking those who would otherwise be part of the anti-fascist front, particularly if they're of African ancestry, given the rather horrible white supremacist politics. And it makes you wonder, because the persons I've made reference to, they consider themselves to be not liberals. As a matter of fact, many of them would see affixing the label liberal to them as being an insult. They see themselves as being to the left of liberalism. And assuming that that is the case, one can only shake one's head in sadness that this is what left of liberalism has come to.
Well, there are people in our community that are saying that we must support Kamala, Ms. Harris, because she can save us. She's better than the other fascism if we don't vote for her. And some people who are known to be very radical on the left are putting forth that argument. How do you respond to that?
I would say, number one, that I'm voting in the state of Texas. For decades now, the state of Texas has been a right-wing bastion. We know that US presidential elections are not a solitary election. They're multiple jurisdiction elections. That is to say, you can win the most votes and lose. You have to win state by state. And my vote will only count in Texas, where the right wing prevails. Hence, I am voting, and on the record for saying so, voting for Cornel West. Now, I would say that there are only about 7 states that are in play, although I find it curious that Mr. Trump has chosen to visit California, which we had thought was not in play. Maybe he knows something we don't know. He has chosen in recent days to visit Colorado, which we had thought was not in play. He has rented Madison Square Garden in New York City. We had thought that New York State is not in play. Perhaps he knows something we don't know. So once again, I'm going to be studying the tea leaves of U.S. presidential politics with microscopic intensity. But as of now, I would urge and suggest our friends who plan to vote for the Democrats, even in a state like Texas, where it appears as of now that Mr. Trump will prevail, that they need simultaneously, it would be in their best interest to ask themselves, is it coincidental or accidental that now we are teetering on the verge of World War III in West Asia, that if not West Asia, Ukraine, and they also need to have a word with the folks of Arab ancestry in Michigan and Illinois, and particularly Michigan, which is one of those swing states, so-called, because there is a mass movement in Michigan amongst people of Arab ancestry not to vote for Democrats. So if you want to stop that mass movement, you need to convince the Arab Americans in Detroit and Dearborn and Flint as to why they should vote for the Democrats despite their record in historic Palestine. I mean, that is my response.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Dr. Gerald Horne. Myself, Norman Richmond, and Melinda Francis are in conversation with Dr. Horne. Melinda, you have some questions?
Yeah, we left on the deck last week. EU trapped between U.S. and the PRC.
Well, let's face it. The European Union is slapping higher tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, following in the steps of the United States of America. One of the issues that we're going to have to follow carefully is that China has leaped ahead in terms of green energy, in terms of solar energy, in terms of wind energy, in terms of electric vehicles. And this may lead to a movement in Europe and in North America to shun Chinese green energy champions, but that in turn will have an adverse impact upon the environment because it'll take a while, if ever, for the United States and the European Union to catch up to China. And this could not happen at a more fraught moment. I'm sure you must have seen headlines about Hurricane Milton following in the footsteps of Hurricane Helene. That is to say, there is this thesis that the frequency and intensity of these hurricanes and tornadoes has a lot to do with global heating and the heating of the waters in particular. And this is having enormous impact on Canada. Now we know that there's this Canadian phenomenon of the snowbirds, of Canadians buying property in Florida. The problem now is that insurance companies are becoming reluctant to sell insurance policies to homeowners in Florida, which is going to have adverse impact upon the value of real estate, leading to real losses to be suffered, including by these snowbirds. Not to mention the fact that you might have seen what happened in Miami some months ago when you had this expensive condominium collapse. And
Yes.
What's happening as a result is that these homeowners associations that govern condominium, the condominium market, they have to go into the insurance market. They're raising homeowner fees because with the condominium, what happens is that you pay a certain fee every month. And now it's going through the roof because in order to shore up these collapsing buildings, there has to be retrofitting and construction costs. And so I say all that to say that this confrontation with China is having enormous downstream impact and consequence, not least in what historically has been the major store of wealth for folk in the United States and to a degree in Canada, which is home ownership. That is to say that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is rapidly disappearing. And this is happening at a moment when U.S. imperialism is trying to find a way, perhaps they will not find a way, to escape this quagmire in West Asia involving Israel, so they can focus like a laser beam on the People's Republic of China. And speaking of which, I should mention that as we speak, many of us are expecting some sort of retaliatory attack by the Israelis on Iran. The fact that they have not done so to this point may suggest that they're getting cold feet. I hope that that's the case, because I would like to warn the Israelis that they need to factor China into their equation as well. On WPFW in Washington just this past week, I told the host of the On the Ground show that Israel might be in a position analogous to that of Iraq in 1990, 1991, when Saddam Hussein sought to intervene in neighboring Kuwait. And he was surmising that with past practice, that the then Soviet Union would intervene on his behalf. He had not calculated on the change in Communist Party of Soviet Union leadership under Gorbachev, that Soviet assistance was not forthcoming. And of course, Mr. Saddam Hussein and his forces got shellacked. And likewise, Israel apparently is surmising, given past practice, that U.S. imperialism will have these resources and sources otherwise to intervene on their behalf in case they get into a dust-up with Iran. I'm not sure if that's the case. I'm not sure if U.S. imperialism wants to risk World War III, despite the obvious power of the Zionist lobby in the United States of America. And so perhaps I would like to think, at least, that the Israelis are factoring in the changing global correlation of forces into their political analysis. And perhaps that is what has led them to have cold feet. And I should also mention the role of France, because France has called for an arms embargo against Israel. And in fact, the Mediterranean European countries, including Spain and Malta, are all on board with regard to that. Earlier, Norway and Ireland had expressed reservations about a full-throated pro-Israeli policy. So Israel really has some serious thinking to do. And finally, I should mention, in terms of Israeli calculations, in case their embassy in Washington is not following the news carefully, that the celebrated Black American writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates, the son of the former Black Panther Paul Coates, who, as you know, founded Black Classic Press. In full disclosure, I published a book with Black Classic Press and am on YouTube having discussions with Paul Coates. But Ta-Nehisi Coates, his new book, The Message, excoriates Israel as being a Jim Crow and apartheid state. He's been doing the rounds on the major networks in the United States, believe it or not, except that on CBS, a major corporate media outlet, a host with ties to Israel, castigated his analysis in very feverish terms, which led to internal conflict at CBS, And what's interesting is that the outgoing chief shareholder of CBS, speaking of Sherry Redstone, who is a prominent member of the Jewish American community, she sided with her host against management at CBS, which sided with Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so I see that as further evidence of second and third thoughts at the highest levels of US imperialism with regard to going over the cliff hand in hand with Israel, particularly as noted when there is a so-called bipartisan consensus in Washington that China should be focused on like a laser beam.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We only have about 5 minutes left. Did you want to talk about the next PM of the UK? Is it an African, a Negro, or a Black Brit woman? How do you describe her?
Benedott, she's probably the most conservative candidate. And this actually ties into the opening segment, because if we were to think in simplistic gender terms, like some tend to do, we'd point to the fact of Kimmy, who is a Tory of Nigerian extraction, a possible future British prime minister, stone cold reactionary. Or we could focus on the woman now in the pole position to be governor of Virginia, speaking of Winsome Sears, who is of Jamaican extraction, by the way, stone cold reactionary. Or we could point, to the fact that when Kamala got her start in politics, she defeated a man to her left, speaking of Terrence Hallinan, of a storied San Francisco family that was close to Paul Robeson, by the way. And when the current district attorney, that was the office that Kamala won, the current district attorney in San Francisco, Brooke Jenkins, she got her office by being the front person for a recall of a man to her left. Speaking of Chesa Boudin, who of course is a descendant of Leonard Boudin, who was a storied lawyer for Paul Robeson and the Communist Party and many others, and Chesa was following in his grandfather's footsteps. Now, if I were a simplistic gender thinker, I'd point to all these examples and say, what's up with these Black women? But what we need to realize, Mr. Obama, for example, is that the United States is listening to the right, that inevitably there will be those, including in traditionally oppressed communities, who will be impacted and affected and influenced, be it Black women or Black men, and singling out one gender or another, trying to suggest that they are turning to the right without considering the overall political environment and climate. You're basically playing the game of the US ruling class, and surprise, surprise, why is Mr. Obama doing that?
You're listening. We only have about 3 minutes left. I would really like to hear your thoughts on Bronny James and his situation, but I don't know. Maybe you want to save that until next week so you can be more detailed.
Well, I can lead off. We can always tackle it again. So this is the son of LeBron James. LeBron James and his son Bronny are now playing for the Lakers. There have been really sharp criticisms of Bronny James's competency on the basketball court. There are those that are suggesting that he's taking a job that really should be going to somebody else. They're wondering about his game, as they say. At USC during 1 year, first of all, he had this near-death health episode, and he averaged less than 5 points per game in any case. So, look, I don't know what deal LeBron James worked out with the management, Perhaps he's taking a cut rate salary, so they hired his son. But in any case, these other issues, like the possible onset of World War III, I think should be higher on our agenda, with all respect to Mr. Bronny James.
And anything you wanted to add, Melinda? We have 1 minute left.
No, I think we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week. And yeah, we'll get into it next week.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Horne.
Good luck to you.
Lisa Watson on the buttons. Thank you for